Segregation in the United States has always been a complex and multifaceted issue, deeply rooted in the country's history and affecting various aspects of life, including housing, education, employment, civil rights, and social interactions. It also has deeply influenced the U.S. judicial system, resulting in persistent racial disparities in policing, legal proceedings, sentencing, and incarceration. African Americans have been disproportionately targeted by law enforcement due to stereotypes and biases. This practice has led to higher rates of stops, searches, and arrests. Historically, there has been a lack of accountability for police officers involved in misconduct, fostering mistrust between minority communities and law enforcement. In courtroom procedures, judges, attorneys, and jurors may harbor implicit biases that affect their decisions, leading to unfair trials and biased outcomes. Today's video will get you an insight how segregation and racial bias tore a family apart, but not their spirit. Hey guys, welcome back to Crimeco, your go-to channel for some intriguing and incredible true crime stories. Before we continue with today's case, remember to subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and turn on the notifications. So buckle up and get ready to go on a wild ride with us. Almost 80 years ago, the U.S. legal system made a terrible mistake completely biased by racism. The life of a young man was cut short by a group of white men who thought they knew and were better just because of the color of their skin. Let's go back to 1944, more precisely to Alcaluz, South Carolina. At that time, segregation was strong in town and whites and blacks lived in different parts of the city that was divided by a railroad. In this town, a hardworking black family was living as peacefully as they could until tragedy knocked on their door. The head of the household was a man called George Stinney Sr. He was a sharecropper who worked in a sawmill, and her wife, Amy Stinney, was a cook at Alcaluz all-black school. They had a big family and worked hard to provide for them. Today's case involves one of their sons, a boy named George, just like his father. He was the second of 5 siblings, and the company where his father worked gave them a nice house big enough to suit all the family members. The Stinneys made everything they could to live a good life despite the strong racism they faced during those days, and teach their children about how to interact with people who might judge them for their race. But their seemingly quiet life was disturbed when the police showed up at their door. George's parents weren't at home, but since it was the police knocking on their door, he thought that maybe something happened to their parents and the officers were there to inform him and his siblings about it. But he thought wrong. The police officers forcefully took George and his older brother, Johnny, out of the house. Their little sister, who was also in the house, ran scared to hide the small chicken coop they had in the backyard, while her brothers were put in handcuffs and taken into custody after being pointed out as suspects in a serious crime. The crime in question had to do with 2 white girls named Betty June, 11 years old, and Mary Emma Thames, 7 years old at the time, who went missing in town, and George was apparently the last person who saw them. Apparently, on a normal sunny day in March 1944, George and his sister Amy were walking home from grazing the family cow when they crossed paths with these 2 girls. It seemed that they were on an adventure to find a fruit called a maypop, and they stopped to ask George and his sister where they could find it. After a brief exchange of words, both sets of children parted ways with each other, but when the 2 girls didn't go back to their home by sundown, the police were called, and a search party was on the streets right away to look for them. Lots of people, including George's father, spent the whole night looking for the missing girls. George knew that maybe he could help the police find them if he told them about their encounter, but he was also hesitant for obvious reasons. However, he needed to do what was right, and if he could help in any way to get those girls back home, then he would. So he told the police that he had seen them on his way home and that they were looking for some maypops. But neither he nor his sister knew, so they went on their way. The police took this information into consideration for their search, and George thought he had been of help. Unfortunately, the next morning, their bodies were found in a muddy ditch. Emma had a hole in her head, and Betty June had been hit in the head. The autopsy showed that she had been hit 7 times with a round object, which crushed the bones in the back of her head. The deaths of these 2 young girls shook the town to its core, and soon everyone began to wonder who could do something so awful like this. There were several theories about what happened to them. One version that put young George in a tough spot said that he had followed them home after their meeting and killed them with a railroad spike while trying to rape Betty June. Another theory that was passed around is just some gossip stated that the girls stopped by the house of a well-known man in the area to see if his friendly wife would like to join them on their quest to find maypops. And when she said she couldn't, her son offered to drive them in his lumber mill truck, never to be seen or heard from again. But at that time, the police weren't too interested in finding a white killer, especially since they'd already had a good scapegoat. So they arrested George and his older brother, whom they thought were the ones who killed the man in a horrible way. But it wasn't just a thought they had. They were set on blaming 2 poor black kids for a crime they didn't commit, perhaps in an attempt to make themselves look better, stronger, and more civilized, just because they were white. White privilege isn't just an abstract thing when people actually act on it. George's odds weren't the best. Not only was he surrounded by white police officers who seemed to think he was a murderer, but his family wasn't even allowed in the room where he was being questioned, so the officers basically harassed the poor kid into confessing something he didn't do. And he had to go through it all by himself, without a lawyer or his family. By the time the trial came, his lawyer, Charles Plowden, didn't seem very interested in proving that his client was innocent. He didn't get anyone to testify, didn't cross-examine anyone, and didn't even look at the barely existing evidence. In fact, the evidence that was used to prove that he was guilty was all circumstantial and didn't follow the right legal steps. The only thing they had against George was that he talked to the girls on the day they died, and that the officer, H.S. Newman, who was in charge of the case, and the other people on the interrogation team said that George had confessed. They didn't even have a written or signed statement in which George admitted to the crimes. The trial was a sham based solely on what those white officers had to say. On April 24, 1944, the all-white jury took 10 minutes to decide that he was guilty and sentenced him to death by electrocution. Those 10 minutes would shape the life of a family and mark an unsettling historical event in the U.S. legal system. George became the youngest executed in the country and continues to hold that spot to this day. One upsetting aspect of this case is that there were no members of George's own race on the jury, which consisted only of 12 white men. At the time, black people weren't allowed in court, and that poor little boy had to endure being judged by a white jury all alone in the courtroom because his family was not allowed in. In town, George's family also had a difficult time. According to newspapers of that year, the word that a black boy had killed 2 white girls quickly spread around, and people were planning on setting their house on fire and killing everyone in it. They almost succeeded, but it turned out that George's father had lost his job, and the company had evicted them from their home. But there was still some hope, since several ministerial unions of all races signed petitions to stop George's execution. Lots of people wrote letters and sent telegrams to the governor's office asking for clemency, but none of them worked. Protests were held to warn Governor Olin Johnson about rising racial tensions, but he still gave no response. It is uncertain if George saw his parents for the last time before he was executed, since tensions were high. He was kept almost hidden in a dark cell, waiting for his fate to be fulfilled. On June 16, 1944, George was led to the electric chair. He was about 5 feet, 1 inch tall, and weighed about 95 pounds. With a strong hold of his Bible, he sat in the chair that was obviously too big for him. He was so small that it was hard for the staff to put electrodes on his arms and legs. They even took the Bible and put it under his seat to raise it up. From his family, his father was the only one allowed to be present and to say goodbye. An officer then asked George if he had any last words, but he just turned his head away, fully aware that nothing he could say then would make everyone believe him. They pulled a strap tight and put it over his mouth, and then bound his hands and legs. George started to cry as the people who were going to kill him got him ready. They put on an adult mask that didn't fit right while he was crying his heart out. His time was running out. The staff got the signal to proceed, and suddenly, 2,400 volts of electricity were sent through George's little body. He began to jerk so violently that the mask on his face fell off, allowing everyone to see his wide-eyed, teary-covered face. After 2 more shocks, George was pronounced dead. In just 3 months, the state of South Carolina arrested, charged, tried, convicted, and killed a 14-year-old boy for a murder he didn't commit. In 2014, 70 years after George Stinney was put to death for murder, his conviction was looked at again. His siblings had always thought he was innocent because he had an alibi. George had been with his sister and me the whole day the girls were gone. One of the witnesses was his sister, who stated that it was strange to see them in our area because white people stayed on their side of Al-Qadr and we knew our place. The police didn't care about an alibi, though. It was clear that the whole case was a racist hoax, so a few people tried to clear his name, which they did. A motion for a new trial was filed with the help of George Frierson, a historian from the same town as George, who had studied the case since he first heard about it. There were also rumors about a death confession that revealed that someone had already been named as the person responsible for the crime. It was said that the person who did this was a white man from a well-known family who had died by 2013. Not only that, but the person who did it was also on the jury for George's fake trial, which made things even worse. But unfortunately, this new piece of information wasn't able to be confirmed. It wasn't until January 2014 that real, valid proof was given at a court hearing. Wilford Hunter, who used to be George's cellmate, was a witness who was not related to George and, since then, was a more viable witness for the case. He said that George never wrote a confession, but he told him that he was forced to confess even though he wasn't guilty. George's confession was thrown out because, after all, this evidence was an unrecorded, unsigned confession from a 14-year-old boy who didn't have a lawyer or parents to help him. In December 2014, Judge Cullen Mullen threw out George's conviction because he didn't get a fair trial and his Sixth Amendment right was broken. She decided that killing a 14-year-old boy in less than 90 days was cruel and unusual punishment, which was against the law because of the Constitution. George's siblings were happy to be alive and see that their brother's name was cleared after 70 years, but this doesn't make up for the terrible injustice they had to go through. George's brother Charles says he already paid for this life and nothing, and even if they take it off, it won't bring him back. Looking back, it is possible to confirm that this poor kid never really had a chance. Racial discrimination was at its peak, and he paid the price for only having a quick chat with 2 little girls, a price that no one should ever pay. His life was cut short. He was accused of a crime he never committed, and he died surrounded by strangers. Only because he was black. It took almost 80 years, but his name was finally cleared. May he rest in peace. Thanks again for joining us in this story. Before you go, let us know what you think about this incredible case in the comment section. We'll see you again in the next one.